The other question we really need to be considering, and we have to consider it all the time, is that there is possibly going to be a change of government in the next year. We've got the situation where the Labour Party is unfortunately committed to constitutional change, which is rather strange historically when you think that some of the greatest Australian Prime Ministers, Labour Prime Ministers, have been also some of the greatest constitutional monarchs. Curtin, for example, was a strong constitutional monarch, as was a constitutional monarchist, as was many other Labour leaders. But Labour has chosen to put in its platform a commitment to Australia becoming a republic. The question of a republic has been on the agenda since the Keating years. Paul Keating converted republicanism from being a topic for discussion in dinner parties in elite suburbs. He made it into a real political issue, and it took 10 years. It was a dominant issue, and politicians spent a lot of time over 10 years. I'm not sure that they have sufficient time for discussing big national issues, and this took up a lot of time, and it resulted in no success in relation to a republic, and they seem determined to do it again. The Republican movement, when it lost the inevitable Republic referendum in 1999, then sat on whatever new model they wanted, and they hid behind a new idea, and that was, they borrowed it, I think, from the European Union, and that was to make the people keep on voting until they got it right. And their plan was to have a plebiscite. A plebiscite is where you're asked a question, and when you answer it, they then give you the details. It was a favourite with Napoleon. The two Napoleons, they both asked the French people a general question and then acted on it in the way that they always intended. A referendum, the one we have, borrowed from Switzerland, has all the details on the table before you vote. There has to be a bill. You have to know precisely what is going to happen before you vote. So the Republicans had this first plebiscite. Do you want a republic? It will now be, do you want a republic with an Australian as head of state? In other words, a trick question, a dog whistle question, because that's a debatable issue. We say we already have an Australian as head of state. If that goes through, there'll be a second plebiscite, and that'll be, what model do you want? And there'll be a list of 4. Executive president, so on, parliamentary president. And then, when they've got that answer, then there'll be the referendum. And the idea is to lock people in so that they are committed. Whether Australians will be so locked in is not sure. And that's been their position for almost 22 years, 21 years, over 2 decades. And we say they've been hiding their preferred model for 2 decades, whatever it is. Earlier this year, the Republican movement announced that they were dropping that. They were going to have a new process, and that was they were going to announce their model this year. The Labour Party then held a national conference. It just so happened that they held a national conference. It was a much more directed national conference than usual. It was held in a directed way because of the excuse of the epidemic. And they changed their platform. They took away the 2 plebiscites and the referendum. They said too, we're going to go to a referendum in which the people will vote on a model and we'll announce the model. So you can conclude from that that the Australian Republican movement and the Australian Labor Party are working hand in hand on this issue. The interesting thing is what's going on in the background. In 1999, Republicans were terribly divided, so much so that a group called the Real Republicans effectively became our allies. The government made our allies because the government said, we're giving each side 10 million to help them with their campaigns, and we'll award the seats on the percentage of votes you got in the Constitutional Convention elections. We got 80% of the seats. They worked out of all the groups that were opposed to the referendum, the particular referendum got 100%, and we got 80% of those. And the Real Republicans, who also opposed to the model going from the constitutional referendum, got 20%. So we got Clem Jones and, can't think of his name, he was the member for North Sydney, the independent... Ted Mack, yes. Both very good men. Clem Jones was the former Labor Lord Mayor of Brisbane, very rich, made a lot of money in real estate activities, and he's left a lot of money to the Real Republicans. And the Real Republicans are the fly in the ointment from the point of view of the Australian Republican movement. The Real Republicans want a president elected by the people. The model they put to the convention restricted the candidates for the presidency to those approved by Parliament, and there were only a limited number of candidates. There was a free model where any number of people could nominate a candidate for president. That was the model proposed by Bill Hayden, the former Labor leader and former Governor-General. That model attracted very few votes at the Constitutional Convention. It was one of the early models to be knocked out. So the Real Republicans want an elected Prime Minister, elected by the people, basically in the same...
President? Not Prime Minister?
No, elected President. Did I say Prime Minister? Elected President, elected directly by the people, but with the same powers as the Governor-General. And what all Conservatives suspect is that an elected President by the people with the powers of the Governor-General might take a lot of those powers now exercised on convention seriously and play a political role. And I remember when this was first suggested, I wrote a piece suggesting this was trying to bring to Australia the French Fifth Republic, where you have both a Prime Minister and a President. The President could be a significant political figure if he wished to be. So a lot of Republicans, like Bob Carr, Paul Keating, don't like the idea of the people electing the President. So there's a big division among Republicans. I believe that the Republican movement behind the scenes, and I've seen no documents in support of this, I'm just putting two and two together. They conducted a major campaign over what were called the Palace Letters. They were suggesting that the reserve powers were abused.
That wasn't it.
Ah, right. Oh, Jeff Phillips already arrived. They were suggesting that the Republican movement was what the Republican movement was doing was attacking the reserve powers, attacking the very idea of reserve powers. What I think they're coming up with is a compromise model in which the president is elected by the people but has absolutely no powers. Everything in the Constitution will say he must act as advised by the Prime Minister. It'll be so clear that the president is just a puppet and will have absolutely no powers. That's the compromise they're working on. And they announced earlier this year, in about March, that later on this year, by the end of the year, they would release their model. They thought that in the interim, they would reach an agreement with the real Republicans, who have all of Clem Jones' money, but also could make trouble for them in any campaign by campaigning separately. They thought that they would get the real Republicans agreed with them that the president be elected but have absolutely no powers. Now, I suspect that no respectable real Republican would agree to just having a president with no powers. I think they'd want the president to at least have something like the reserve powers. I think that they are having trouble getting the agreement they thought was easy to get with the real Republicans. Why do I think that? Because they haven't revealed their model, which suggests that there's a friction between them. Now, as I say, there is a chance of a change of government in the next election. And if it were to be a Labour government, they are committed to holding a referendum on the Republic. But if you look at the debates that they've been holding, particularly the freer convention that they held for the platform, not this year but the previous year, it's obvious that the members of the Labour Party have a higher priority in terms of referendums than the constitutional referendum. And that is the Aboriginal referendum, the referendum to establish the advisory body, which some people call the third chamber. That, it seems clear from what some of the Labour politicians have said, that if they get into power, the first referendum of the first referendum will be the Aboriginal one, the second one will be on a republic. They might be foolish enough to put them both up at the same time, but that would probably doom both of them to be defeated. I would think that if they're going to put up a referendum, it will be the Indigenous one first. So we would have time in relation to this. The Indigenous one might well be lost. ACM will take no position on that, but it will be a testing as to how the Australian people react to referendums. So what we have to think of is how we should be campaigning if, in fact, there is a change of government. And what we've found, and Will was a strong suggestion of this, is that videos do work. Facebook, which we already had, is working very well. And operating as we always have on a shoestring, what do you think we should be doing in terms of campaigning? If, in fact, there is, it's the second time I've done that. I'm dangerous up here. Yes. Would you like to come down so that you can be filmed and compromised?
I'm very interested, David, in the timetable you give there, especially about the Indigenous referendum come first. And I think that's actually a huge opportunity for ACM at that time. And I want to put the reasons for that. Within the Labor movement, or the left in general, there's a huge split on how far to go on the Indigenous. And the furthest part, and I think we're heading to it because other countries have done it, is First Nations and dividing Australia up into sovereign First Nations. And I just think there's then the opportunity for ACM to say, that's actually what we support. And I don't mean that we support that as opposed to Australian constitutional monarchy, but we can't see any way in the middle. Either we go all the way to there's a relinquishment of the Crown and every sovereignty over Australia, and we come to First Nations and so on, or else we stay where we are. because I think that might wedge the Australian people very effectively. Both those Paddington Liberal members that you talk about, who will accept a republic, but they won't accept Australia being broken up into First Nations. And it's a big opportunity. It's a dangerous opportunity in some ways, but it's a powerful opportunity for ACM to say, the republic that you want to put in place is only a temporary measure until you break it up into First Nations, and therefore the left should have the speak what they actually believe in of let's go to First Nations, because I think Australians will reject that, but then it actually pulls back the debate in the left and it splits the left rather than splitting the right.
You're saying we should take part in the debate on an Indigenous referendum?
And on the basis that we believe the current arrangements are the best, but we believe the republic would only be a stepping stone towards the First Nations, and that they need to be honest about what their intentions are there, because the republic, as I see it, is just a transitory stage until Australia is divided up into these First Nations.
That's a twist.
Any opinions on that? It's a daring proposal?
Scary.
Courageous.
And who dares wins. So I think it's quite a good idea. I like the idea of wedging as well. I think this is something that the other side does and mostly successfully. One of the things that intrigues me, just listening to what you've been saying, David, is the question that is going to be asked. And it always seems to be the question demanded by the Republicans. So do you want an Australian republic with an Australian head of state? Why can't we demand the question to be, do you want Australia to remain the successful, prosperous country it is under an Australian head of state and our sovereign, or do you want Australia to turn into a banana republic? And put that out there. Now, whether that would be accepted, of course, is remain to be seen. But
That's the real question.
it's the question, and put it up and say, let's have this as the question.
Whatever the question is, we must be the no vote. No votes almost always win, so we don't want to become the yes vote. Of the 38, correct me if I'm wrong, for 38 referendums we've had in Australia, I think the yes votes won 6. 44. The yes votes won 6, and they're all procedural. Apart from the Aboriginal one, they're all procedural.
Right. Do you want to become a banana republic?
No.
That's the question.
No, but that's an excellent.
Yes, I think that would be a very good idea. But if we have the Aboriginals in, how long before we're half a dozen republics or 20 republics or 200 republics? Every Aboriginal tribe wanting its own republic. So I think, yes, we should be in it somewhere somehow.
There's a difference between ACM taking a position and individuals taking a position. And we'd have to see what precisely was being proposed, and and if within the Charter this is something on which ACM should be having a position. That would be our approach so far, that we have as an organisation. There's nothing to stop any of us from having opinions. We don't tell people what opinions they should have. But as an organisation, we've tended, I think properly, take the view, well, is that within our mission? And the mission is summarised in the motto, which is to preserve, protect and defend the constitutional system of Australia, the role of the Crown in it, and the Australian flag. When we put in the Australian flag, we even had some people saying, no, you shouldn't include the flag because that's not part of the constitutional system. But the overwhelming view was to include the flag. Yes.
One other point for which ACM could well wedge the other side very effectively, which I think is China, because almost all the old prominent Republicans are now very pro us pivoting to China in a major way. And I think if it was seen that the ACM said part of the reasons to stay a monarchy is the moment we change that, then it's like the Solomons or what may happen in New Zealand and so on, we will pivot to China as a result of becoming a republic. I believe there's a section of the Australian electorate who at the moment would vote for a republic, but if they thought part of that was to become a vassal state for China, they would rather hold on to the Queen. And I think the best argument for that, strangely, is what we were talking about in Canada before, that the only reason that Canada doesn't let go of the Queen is why shouldn't they then join the United States?
Just on that question of China, I noted in my piece about Barbados, this is me speaking privately, personally, not speaking as on behalf of ACM. Paul Keating was the former Australian Prime Minister who changed Australian republicanism from being an item for idle discussion at dinner parties in the nation's elite salons. He turned so-called republicanism into a political issue which absorbed too much of the politicians' and media's attention over almost a decade. Despite the view of the political class and the media that it was inevitable, it failed in a landslide, a thumbs down by the people, nationally and in every state. Keating, who says he knows everything about China because he talks to the top leadership, went on to record at La Trobe University in 2017 to declare that the Beijing Communist government was, quote, the best government in the world in the last 30 years. The best government in the world in the last 30 years. I remember saying on another occasion, well, is that the model that we're looking at? It's interesting the number of leading Republicans, not that one over there, the number of leading Republicans who've developed a close relationship with China. The minister who did the free trade agreement under the Abbott government left Parliament suddenly before the actual finalisation of the free trade agreement and took a very well-paid position with the company which acquired the lease of Darwin.
David,
He was
30
also-
years included Tiananmen Square.
Yes, yes, and he also during the referendum fronted an organisation called Conservatives for an Australian Head of State. Mr. Turnbull had all these little I call them front organisations. That's probably unfair, but there was one called Conservatives for an Australian Head of State. That was run by the same man, a Liberal, who was the one who did the free trade agreement with China. There is this interesting alignment of some of our leading Republicans, except one, with the People's Republic of China, which, yes, I didn't mention his name. He's not very happy when that's mentioned, I gather. Well, we obviously may find ourselves in campaign mode if there is a change of government, but I do think that the Indigenous referendum will be first, and your views on that are interesting. In our next session, Keith Windschuttle will be here, who is a very prominent defender of the unity of Australia, and he does one of his books related to this very question concerning the breaking up of Australia because of this idea of the First Nation people and so on, which is not anti-Aboriginal. This is Senator Neville Bonner was the first Aboriginal member of the National Parliament. He was a great constitutional monarchist. He led he certainly was part of the Queensland delegation of ACM to the National Convention, and he gave a speech during the convention defending the monarchy, asking why it was the theme of the speech was "How dare you?" Having told us that this system is so good, how dare you change it? It was borrowed by a Swedish schoolgirl, I think. She must have seen it on the internet. "How dare you" was the theme, and it was the only speech at the convention which received a standing ovation, except for John Howard's. John Howard came at the end of the convention. They hadn't got they hadn't got a full majority. The model went through, but it was only a plurality. It didn't cover more than 51% or 51% of the votes. And the Republicans were, the Australian Republican movement was sad because they said, oh, this won't go to the referendum. But Howard came to close the convention and he said it would be foolish with the vote that there is not to put this to a referendum. The Republicans cheered, the monarchists sat there all quiet, the Republicans cheered John Howard when he announced that there would in fact be a referendum. In fact, there are so many lies told about John Howard and the convention. It said he rigged the convention. Well, he didn't. And I pointed out to him, he had a number of seats which were in the Prime Minister's gift. There were seats which were elected, there were seats which were nominated, most of which were ex officio political seats, like premiers and leaders of the opposition and so on. But then there were ones in his gift, and he decided to appoint people who weren't at the convention but should be very prominent Australians, young people and Indigenous people. And when I looked at the votes, I said, I went to him, I said, Prime Minister, you've loaded the convention against us. Almost 2/3 of the people you nominated turned out to be Republicans. He said, yes, and it's unfortunate, isn't it? So he did not rig the convention. And then they said he chose the model. This was after they lost. John Howard chose the model. Well, of course he didn't. It was the convention that chose the model, and the convention was dominated by Mr. Turnbull's group on the Republican side. And then they said he rigged the question. Well, the question wasn't written by John Howard. It was written by a parliamentary committee. I remember appearing before them, a parliamentary committee on which there wasn't one constitutional monarchist. Eric Abetz, who was the closest to a constitutional monarchist at the time, the first thing he said to Kerry Jones was, well, why didn't you support the McGarvey model, which was the model to replace the Queen with a committee of old former governors and chief justices. It was called the least worst model. Old Codger's model. Anyway, but the whole committee which wrote the question, which is the title of the bill, the whole committee that wrote the question was a Republican committee, and they wouldn't change the question. We wanted the way in which the president can be dismissed in the question, because we thought that was even more important than the way the president was to be elected, because the president could be dismissed at any time by the Prime Minister without notice, without grounds, and without any right of appeal. And we thought the Australian people should know that even more than how he's elected. But the Republican committee wouldn't have a bar of that, but they wouldn't accept Mr. Turnbull's proposal to remove the word president and remove the word republic. That was going too far and caused too much ridicule. I think we're reaching the close of this panel, so on your behalf I will thank the panellists. I see that Jeff Phillips is here, and we're waiting on Keith Winshuttle, I think, and we can then start the next panel.